King's Cross is a church committed to fully enjoy and share with others the life, grace, and restoration that can only be found in Jesus. If you are unable to visit us on Sunday mornings, you can learn more about King's Cross at kingscrossva.org.
Our scripture reading this morning comes from Matthew 24, verses 15 through 31. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house, and let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for the women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, "Look, here is the Christ," or "There he is," do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, "Look, he is in the wilderness," do not go out. If they say, "Look, he is in the inner rooms," do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, for they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with great power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. This is the word of our Lord.
Good morning once again. If you're new here, you don't know that the use of this pulpit is new. You know, we're tenants here at Stonebridge High School, and we have very good landlords. And I guess every now and again we'll come in and there will be a lectern that's here, and if it's here, we'll use it. Last week it was a music stand. So whatever we have, that's what we'll use. Welcome to King's Cross. What we're doing is we're making our way through one of the four Gospels that are in the New Testament. Gospel is where we go to learn about the life and ministry of Jesus, and one of those Gospels is the Gospel of Matthew. And so we've spent time in Matthew, but as has become a habit of mine, when we run into a portion of Matthew's Gospel that seems to be a single sermon by Jesus, I want to stop and spend time in that single sermon, verse by verse, as if it is a single sermon. And so we are in Sermon 2 of a 6-sermon series called About the End. You see, in this portion of Matthew's Gospel, it would seem as though Jesus is delivering a single sermon about what happens in the end. So just as an example, this is part of the structure of Matthew's gospel. It's just the way Matthew, empowered by the Holy Spirit, writes the gospel. In Matthew chapters 5 through 7, there seems to be a single sermon of Jesus. We call that sermon the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapter 10, it seems to be a single sermon of Jesus, a sermon about evangelism and persecution. Matthew chapter 13, it seems to be a single sermon about the kingdom of God. All the kingdom parables are in Matthew 13. Matthew 18, a sermon about humility as a Christian, who will be the greatest. It's Matthew 18. And here we are then, Matthew 23 through 25. This sermon is nicknamed the Olivet Discourse because it takes place on the Mount of Olives. That's where Jesus is speaking to his disciples. And I want to remind you from last week how this sermon began. Here's how this sermon of Jesus that began in Matthew 23, this is how that sermon began. We talked about this last week. It began with an indictment against the spiritual leaders of the day. All of the religious leaders Jesus seems to swoop together. And he tells his disciples, he says, don't listen to them. He says, they teach in a way that you should not follow. Respect them for their office as they are connected to Moses and the words of the Old Testament. But don't follow them. And don't do what they say. These religious leaders, Jesus says, are hypocrites. They lead people to hell. They break God's law. They praise those who killed the prophets. And they have made Jerusalem a city of murderers, and they themselves belong in hell. And I don't mind saying tongue-in-cheek that is probably the worst sermon introduction ever preached. That was Jesus' sermon introduction. You can see it at the very beginning of Matthew chapter 23. This sermon introduction of Jesus, it would have offended everyone. I mean, keep in mind that Jesus is preaching during the season of the Passover. And Jesus is himself about to be crucified on the cross. And he opens his sermon with an indictment against the religious leaders. But there's something very interesting about that sermon introduction, rather. He actually introduces his sermon by making an indictment against the religious leaders, and we begin to see the disciples cringe at the words of that introduction. I am grateful that we're a Presbyterian church. Presbyterians don't do a lot of this anyway, but I am grateful that I get to preach at a church in which the congregation does not ordinarily interrupt me. I just become flustered when that happens. Presbyterians, they don't do congregational interruption. Maybe you knew that, maybe you didn't. But the disciples, they interrupt Jesus' sermon. And they interrupt Jesus' sermon to ask a couple of questions. And these questions are relevant to the passage that my brother Paul just read to us this morning. Their interruption, you see this in Matthew 24, verse 3. The disciples came to him privately. The disciples, they came to him privately. And they have a question for Jesus. Jesus has just finished the introduction to a sermon. And it's almost as if they're saying, whoa, hold up here, Jesus. And they say to him, tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? You hear that? When will these things be? You know what they're talking about. Yeah, Jesus' indictment against the religious leaders was so powerful in his introduction that Jesus actually responds to the disciples when they begin to praise the construction of the temple. Just a couple of days ago, I was downtown and walked around the Capitol building. And it would be as if the disciples, upon hearing the introduction of Jesus' sermon, interrupt Jesus and they say, Jesus, but yeah, isn't that U.S. Capitol beautiful? How it's constructed. Isn't that wonderful? And that's how they're talking about the temple. And we wonder if maybe they're doing that because it's awkward. Jesus' introduction has been so forceful, and it's awkward. They're trying to lighten the mood just a little bit. And it doesn't lighten the mood at all, because Jesus says, every one of those stones, one at a time, will be thrown down. And then Jesus returns to his sermon. Now, here's why I don't normally do this. Here's why I went through that great length to describe to you what we discussed last week here for worship. I've described it because the application that Jesus had for us last week is the application that Jesus has for us this morning. Jesus' application for the disciples, when they asked the question, when is this going to happen and what will be the sign? Jesus' application was this: two things. Make sure you know who the true Christ is. You remember this from last week? Application number one, make sure you know who the true Christ is. Know me well. And the second application Jesus had for his disciples last week is to endure. Endure. When all of these things happen, your job is to endure. Never let your heart grow cold. Those are the two applications from last week, and there are two applications for this week. And let me remind you why those are the two applications. Because Jesus says this in Matthew 24:14. The gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations. And then the end will come. You see, Jesus' focus is that a Christian is to know Christ and to endure in all things. Why? Because the gospel must be proclaimed to all nations. That's the great application last week. It's a great application this week. So what can you count on, Christian? Let me just remind you. If you're here this morning, you profess faith in Jesus. Jesus told us in the introduction of his sermon, he says that nothing stops the proclamation of the gospel. No false prophet is going to stop the proclamation of the gospel. The gospel will roll forward. Wars will not stop the gospel. Rumors of wars, political battles, natural disaster, internal strife, persecution, not even your own death will stop the proclamation of the gospel. The gospel, Jesus says, will be proclaimed throughout the world. The theme for this passage that we're looking at this morning is this. With the gospel of Jesus, you are prepared for anything. With the gospel of Jesus, you're prepared for anything. That's what this passage is about. But you had to hear me talk a little bit about Jesus' introduction from last week so that you would be reminded of what your application is and why that application matters. Know who Christ is. Endure all things for his glory. Why? The gospel must be proclaimed. And here this morning, Jesus is saying to us, with the gospel, you are prepared for anything. Now, 2 points in this sermon. I want to talk about a kind of future that Jesus describes. He's going to describe a future that is an immediate future, a near-time future, and then a future that is distant. Here's how I've divided the passage. The first point of the sermon, the immediate future, is in verses 15 through 28. And then in verses 29 through 31, Jesus, he talks about a distant future. But in the near future and in the distant future, the gospel must be proclaimed, and with the gospel, you are prepared for anything. So, the near future, verses 15 through 28. Remember the question that the disciples had. Tell us, Jesus, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming? When and what? You remember from English grammar, those are your interrogative questions. Those are the words when and what. When is a timeline question. What is a visual question? What is going to be the sign, something that I can see? And Jesus is going to begin with the second, with the sign. Look at verse 15, would you? You see how verse 15 opens. A weird verse, no doubt, but look how it opens. So when you see. And all of verses 15 through 28 are those kinds of things that can be ascertained by vision. Because Jesus is beginning with that question that the disciples asked, what will be the sign? So in verse 15, when you see. Also in verse 15, standing in the holy place. That's a kind of thing that you ascertain with your eyes, when you see. But then if you just scan this passage, 15 through 28, just scan it and look at all of the references to those things that you see. Mountains, housetop, house, field, cloak, pregnant women, nursing moms, and of course babies. These are things that you see. Jesus is going to tell you something that you see. Look at verse 23. If anyone says to you, look, do you see that in verse 23? If anyone says to you, look, here's the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. Verse 26, same sort of thing. These are images. They're things that you see. Jesus, he's answering that question, what will be the sign? Their question demands a visual response. Jesus says, this will be the sign. And one last thing. The end of this section, remember, we're still in the first main point of the sermon. Verses 28 and 29. Do you see that those two verses, it's all about the things that you see. As the lightning comes from the east, as it shines. And then even that odd expression, where the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. These are things that we see. Jesus, he's answering the question, what will I see? And really what he's doing, isn't he? He's answering the question, how do I know that you're telling the truth? That's what the disciples are asking. How do I know that you're telling the truth? And Jesus, because he's a loving parent, he's so compassionate. Jesus actually describes the things that they will see. Isn't there some kind of educational motto that you teach a child with your words and you show a child with your actions? There's something like that. I'm not a professional educator, but I just have this feeling that you teach your children by telling them what to do, but then you show them what to do. We all know what this means. We've been taught something, but then our mother or father will tell us, now, when I push this button, watch, this will happen. And then they push the button. When I give this piece of paperwork to the man or woman behind the counter, then they're going to do this. And then they give the man or woman the piece of paper. And Jesus here, in a passage that you and I both know this passage is really confusing, but I want us to see that fundamentally, this passage is about Jesus compassionately, delicately, lovingly teaching his disciples who have interrupted his preaching. And they want to know, what am I going to see, Jesus? And Jesus, he doesn't bat an eye. He should chastise them. What do you mean, what will you see? I am the Messiah. Have I not told you that these past 3 years? And yet Jesus, so loving he is. And he actually tells them, these are things that you're going to see. Now, it is most certainly the case that this passage is confusing, but I want us to understand that, as one scholar calls it, that this is a passage in which it's filled with elusive language of the Old Testament. The passage is filled with, he says, elusive language of Old Testament prophecy. And if we can understand that, it helps us to understand a phrase like the abomination of desolation, which is a weird phrase. I am convinced no one used that phrase this week. Well, maybe you did if you read this passage aloud. Jesus, he's using language that is straight out of the Old Testament, but it's out of the Old Testament in a specific point. Daniel chapter 8, Daniel chapter 9. And Jesus, he's assuming, and he's right to do so, that the disciples, remember, he is teaching the disciples privately. He is assuming that the disciples know exactly what he's talking about when he uses that phrase, abomination of desolation. Daniel 8, Daniel 9. They know exactly what he's talking about. It just sounds super weird to us. I think there might be a little bit of a corollary. In 1979, I was 10 years old, and I lived in Wichita Falls, Texas. And if you're here this morning and you're a Texan, you might know that in 1979, there's a horrible tornado in Texas. I happened to not be home when the tornado was taking place. I was with my, I was with my natural father and my stepmom. But a tornado came through and destroyed Wichita Falls, Texas. And in fact, it was the most expensive tornado in U.S. history up till 1979. But don't you know that if you're a Texan and someone says, I remember 1979, another Texan is likely to recognize what that means? You know that in Wichita Falls, Texas, if someone says, I was here in 1979, the other person who also lives in Wichita Falls, Texas will know exactly what they're talking about. 1979. Or 9/11. Who on this planet doesn't know what 9/11 might refer to? The abomination of desolation sounds to us strange indeed. But I want us to understand that when Jesus is speaking to his disciples, because he is ever compassionate, he is speaking to them in a way that they would naturally understand. Jesus is not trying to be obtuse or to hide his meaning. And so he says in verse 15, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, Jesus is speaking in a way that is clear so that they would understand something. Daniel was a prophet who wrote in the 7th century BC through the 6th century BC. Daniel was writing at a time when Jerusalem was in the process of becoming a pile of rubble. And Nebuchadnezzar was doing that. And Daniel wrote from Nebuchadnezzar to Cyrus. And Daniel mentioned an abomination of desolation that Jesus is translating from the Hebrew into the Greek. But you could understand this as a detestable devastation, as I've heard one commentator say. It was a reference that Daniel makes to something unholy happening to a place of holiness. That's what Daniel is talking about. There's some kind of unholiness that enters into a holy space. In Daniel's terms, he says that there is a king of the north that is going to step into the temple and abolish that sacrificial space. The phrase, let the reader understand, it sounds strange. Some say this is an editorial comment by Matthew, but I think Jesus, he's just trapped in Daniel chapter 8. And a reference to understanding happens a lot in 8 and in 9. And so what Jesus is doing is he is reminding his disciples about what the prophet Daniel said. But there's something more. When was Daniel's prophecy fulfilled? Jesus knew that the religious leaders of the day taught, and the disciples believed, that this prophecy was fulfilled in 167 BC, some 400 years after Daniel's prophesying. And in 167 BC, a Syrian king, Antiochus Epiphanes, comes into the temple and desecrates the temple space. He puts an altar to likely Baal in the temple. And Jesus' disciples would have understood that that was a fulfillment of the prophecy of Daniel. Now, historians of the period, historians in the lifetime of the disciples, also agree this is when Daniel was fulfilled. And this is indeed what Daniel was talking about. Now, we don't know if Jesus believed that this was the event that fulfilled the prophecy of Daniel, but that doesn't matter. We know that Jesus understands that the disciples see that this is actually when it was fulfilled. Daniel, the prophet, was right. And when Jesus says, when you see the abomination of desolation, they're expecting it to happen again. Jesus is saying that is going to happen again. There is going to be something unholy that happens to the holy place. You have to skip down to see this in verse 34. But Jesus says that this generation will not pass away until these things take place. So Jesus is saying that what Daniel prophesied and what was fulfilled in AD 167 is going to happen again. There's going to be some unholiness that enters into the holy space. Wichita Falls, Texas, 1979. It's going to happen again. And dare we even think that something like 9/11 might happen again? And yet Jesus is saying that it's going to happen again. And now, the historians, we don't know exactly what Jesus is referring to, but he's talking about something that the disciples will actually see with their own eyes. So it has to be something that takes place within their lifetime. The Apostle John, original disciple of Jesus, he dies in probably around AD 90. So we're looking for some big event in which there was a profaning of the temple in Jerusalem between AD 33 and AD 90. Well, there's a couple of options, but most commentators, again, I'm not a scholar of ancient history, but most commentators believe that there was a pretty significant event in AD 70. That might count. But AD 70 was the year that General Titus comes through Jerusalem and destroys the temple. That's a standout moment, isn't it? It could be that this is that moment, and it's an important moment because it happens in AD 70, but this general goes on in AD 79 to become the emperor of Rome. Maybe this is the moment. Well, it's hard to say. In fact, I think it's probably impossible to say. But we do know that Jesus is talking about something that happened in a way in which the disciples could actually see it. Judea is going to be overrun in some way. Just look at our passage and you see the details that Jesus has. You can see that homes are going to be lost. Jesus says that a property ownership is going to change. You're going to see people going up into the hills. Jesus says in verse 21, doesn't he, this is going to be something that's unprecedented. Maybe Jesus is speaking in a hyperbolic way. It's something magnificent. But Jesus says people will die. And he's saying that some of the most vulnerable people are going to die. And he says in verse 22 that it's the kind of event that it's going to take some divine act for it to stop. And if it doesn't stop, it's going to get even worse. You see verse 22? So bad. It needs to be stopped by some kind of outside force. And it could be that this is the event of General Titus coming through Rome, AD 70. It could be. We don't know. And there's some imperfections about it. There's some things that General Titus, he didn't do, but Jesus is referencing them. But in this scenario, when this kind of thing happens, when the people are hustled out of the city, there's a profanation that takes place in the temple. When this happens, I think Jesus wants his disciples to understand not only is it a great moment, but it's a horrible moment for Judaism. That in this moment, Judaism is going to be broken. Jesus seems to speak as if there won't be a temple anymore. There certainly is not going to be Passover celebrations anymore. Everyone is directed to leave the city. Law-keeping, as the Pharisees understood it, can't be practiced anymore. Do you see in the passage a reference to the Sabbath? The Judaism of the scribes and the Pharisees is not going to rescue this situation. Jesus wants his disciples to understand that. What you are going to see, he doesn't say in AD 70, but he's saying to the disciples, what you're going to see will wreck Judaism, but it won't wreck the gospel. You see how the application, it continues. What do you think the disciples are supposed to do between the death of Jesus on the cross and his resurrection and his ascension and AD 70 when this event happens? What do you think the disciples are supposed to do? We've already been told. The disciples are supposed to understand, as Jesus reiterates again in 24 and 25, you must know Christ. Because in this kind of terror, there are going to be false Christs. And members of the church are going to run after these false Christs because they're so scared. And Jesus said, you need to know me. And you need to endure. Again, the application from the introduction of his sermon. You need to endure, despite this bad thing happening, a profanation of the temple, despite this. Nursing moms' lives are threatened. Despite this, endure. Never let your heart run cold. The application, don't you see it works for this imminent disaster? It's near. It's going to happen in this generation, Jesus says, but know me and endure. I think it's very interesting proof to look at verse 25. You see what verse 25 says? It says, see, I have told you beforehand. See, I have told you beforehand. It could be that when the disciples are listening to this sermon, that phrase, see, I told you beforehand, it doesn't help them at all. Surely their hearts are worried. Something really bad is going to happen. Jesus told us. But when Jesus says, see, I have told you beforehand, I just wonder if Jesus is teaching them how to praise life during and after this horrible occasion. See, I told you beforehand. This horrible thing is going to happen in AD 70. A terror comes to Jerusalem and the temple will be destroyed. But wouldn't it be very comforting if you were a Christian living during that time? And you could remind yourself, yeah, Jesus said this would happen. He said this would happen. Isn't that a powerful expression? Jesus is actually exercising more authority than the angel who is speaking to Daniel in Daniel 8 and 9. Daniel's receiving these words from an angel. And Jesus is more authoritative than an angel. And imagine how comforting it would be. See, I told you beforehand. And if you're here this morning and you're a Christian, how many times has Jesus told his disciples that they will suffer under persecution for their faith? How many times has Jesus said that? It's not countless. I just don't know the answer. But a lot. Christian, isn't it comforting to you that Jesus, even amidst your persecution, marginalization, feeling like an outcast at work or in your neighborhood because you believe in that old-fashioned thing called Christianity, is it a comfort at all to you that Jesus told you beforehand that this would happen? It is comforting. This is happening by the sovereign rule of King Jesus. He told you in advance that it would happen. And by the way, if that is you, if you are being marginalized because of your faith, he told you this would happen. That's your praise. Take comfort in that. He is sovereign indeed. He said this would happen, and it's happening. Well, I suppose that may not be as comfortable as you'd like, but verse 25 is Jesus teaching his disciples how to praise him. The application, before we leave this main point, we understand what the disciples are to do when this horrible thing is happening, or when they're anxious because it's going to happen at some point, and they're always wondering if tomorrow is going to be that day. Their application is still the same. Know who Jesus is. Study him. Meditate upon him. Study what he has taught you. Understand that what he has taught you is sufficient. The Christian, this morning, do you believe that? Do you believe that Jesus is sufficient? Or are you lost in the circumstances of life? Know Jesus afresh this morning, tomorrow morning, the following morning. The disciples know this. And the disciples also know this, that when that day comes, they know that there is no Syrian ruler, that there is no Roman ruler that is greater than the work of the gospel. They know that Jesus will never be defeated. It doesn't matter who desecrates that temple. When the Romans come, well, Jesus is more powerful. Brothers and sisters, when the bank comes looking for the money that you owe, well, Jesus is more powerful than any banker. When the landlord comes to kick you out of the house, Jesus is more powerful than any landlord. When the doctor comes and tells you that you have a terminal disease, Jesus is more powerful than the doctor who brings that news. No problem is too great. Christian, endure for the sake of Jesus. Now, these things that we've been talking about, these things are in the near future. And in verse 29, things get weird in this passage. And I want to use the second point of the sermon, those distant future elements, I want to use as a conclusion of this passage. So verses 29 through 31, the distant future. You might be able to say this, that the first half of the sermon this morning were those things that the disciples would see. Jesus is answering the what will be the signs question. And here, beginning of verse 29, all through to the end of the chapter, Jesus is answering the when question. This is a timeline question. And really he's answering it by being very unspecific. When we look at verses 29 through 31, scholars will differ here. I mean, denominations are born out of an understanding of 29 through 31. One commentator says 29 through 31 is a collage of Old Testament apocalyptic language. And to be sure, beginning at verse 29, the number of Old Testament references is staggering. I mean, just in 29 through 31, we have Isaiah 34, Isaiah 13, Ezekiel 32, Amos 8, Joel 2, Zechariah 12, Daniel 7. What do you think Jesus is doing? Sun will be darkened, moon will not give its light, stars fall down from heaven. Oh, such a complex passage. But I want you to understand how to read this passage. I want you to understand that it is very difficult to know whether or not Jesus is speaking in tight literalism or not. But if Jesus is speaking with Old Testament imagery, it's not likely that he's speaking with tight literalism. One scholar puts it this way. He says, until this prophetic panorama becomes history, we shall probably not know how much of this description must be taken literally and how much figuratively. Don't we understand that so much of Christianity is about that? I mean, Christianity, we understand now, but we will understand so much better at the second coming. There are things about my life that are a challenge. I don't know how to glorify God always with my actions and with my speech and with my thoughts and with my loves. But I won't have that problem after the second coming. In the new heavens and the new earth, I won't have that problem. I'll know exactly how to glorify God with all of my heart, soul, and my strength. But for now, we don't quite understand what Jesus is after in this passage, but he's speaking with Old Testament imagery. And there are some scholars who say that verses 29 through 31, it's just a different way of understanding when General Titus comes into the city of Jerusalem. It's still that same near event. It's just Jesus is describing it in metaphorical terminology. And that could be. But I don't think it is. I think what Jesus is doing, beginning at verse 29, is he's jumping forward to the second coming. All of this Old Testament apocalyptic language is a reference to the second coming of the Messiah. And I think that's what Jesus is after. It's not easy to see that in this passage. There are some problems. If Jesus is speaking to this generation, is he saying that this is something that this generation will see? I don't think so. Jesus is not saying that you disciples will experience verses 29 through 31. This is something way off in the future. This is something way off in our future. The Christians believe that the second coming hasn't happened yet, but it will come, and that's what Jesus is talking about. Do you see in verse 29 that word immediately? That's the word you should come to me with immediately after the sermon, and you say, yeah, I'm with you, Pastor, but what about that word immediately? Can you just know in advance? I don't have a fabulous answer for that. I just don't. It's hard. Immediately seems like these things all happen right now. But you can also understand immediately that Jesus is not saying it happens immediately. He's just saying if you put it on a timeline, this is the next big event on that timeline. But it is indeed far off in the future at the second coming of Jesus. I know that this is so hard. Listen to this. A Baptist commentator that I like, when he looks at verse 29, he says that this entire section is taken up with the coming of the Son of Man back to earth. This entire section, from verse 29 to the end of the sermon. And that's my position. Verse 29 is talking about a far distant future. And the Old Testament imagery, it works well when we read the passage that way. This is the kind of imagery that Jesus would use to describe an event that is far off in the future, a prophetic expectation. Jesus will say in verse 36, and I think it applies to this passage, he'll say in verse 36, concerning that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven. That's important. Jesus says in verse 36, that concerning that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven. You see, Daniel, he got his information from an angel. But Jesus is saying to his disciples, for the second coming, not even the angels know that. I think that's really important. So if you read verses 29 through 31, and it's about an event way off in the future, and in fact for us, well, we can't say way off in the future, but further down the road. And we could say that it's future to us. We don't know when Jesus is going to return. Jesus is about to tell his disciples what he'll do when he returns, that he's going to judge. But this hasn't happened yet. We anticipate it. But I want us to hear that this reality teaches us a couple of things. First, we're not like the disciples in that we live after AD 70. You see, for the disciples, this was a monumental event, AD 70. And AD 70 was huge. It solidified their belief that Jesus is indeed the Messiah. But it's 2025. AD 70 was a long time ago. We don't have that opportunity for our faith to be buttressed and encouraged by the events of AD 70. But Jesus, he often taught his disciples in this way. He said, if you see this, know I am who I am. And he's saying, if you see AD 70, those horrible events, know that I am who I am. Do you understand that that's what a miracle is? Jesus, he is healing before the eyes of the disciples so that their faith would be encouraged and they would know that he is who he is. He raises people from the dead. He makes the lame walk. He feeds the 4,000 and the 5,000. And every time he does this, he is strengthening the faith of the disciples. It's something that they can see. And that's what AD 70 is about. But we're not like the disciples. We didn't live during that time. And just like we don't expect the healing ministry of a minister today to be exactly like the healing ministry of Jesus, so too, we don't expect an event like AD 70 to be the thing that marks that Jesus really is who he is. No, today we have the Holy Spirit that fills us with assurance that he is who he is. And we don't have AD 70 to look forward to. But just like the disciples, we do have the second coming of Jesus to look forward to. And we never know when that day will be. And the disciples didn't know when that day would be either. We're different from the disciples in that we don't have AD 70, but we're just like the disciples. And that we have this distant future that we are looking forward to. This does mean, I want you to hear this morning as I conclude, this does mean that there's something looming in the future. No one can escape this. You see, the disciples, when they're hearing Jesus preach, they are about to watch Jesus die. And they're going to learn that the death of Jesus does not stop the gospel. And the disciples are going to live their lives up to AD 70. And they're going to witness AD 70, at least a few of them. And they're going to know that those horrible events, just like the cross of Jesus, do not stop the gospel. And for us here this morning, I need all of us to know, especially if you're here this morning and you're not ready to profess faith in Jesus, you need to know that the end of the age will be the end of everything except the gospel. You will survive the end of the age as you believe in the gospel. When you stand before Jesus at that second coming, it will be the gospel that saves you. The relevance of the gospel has not become less because we are after AD 70. The relevance of the gospel is pressing upon us always because you don't know when Jesus returns. That's why the application for this week is the same as the application for last week. Christian, here are your marching orders. Know Christ and know him well, because you don't know when the second coming will come. Christian, endure for the sake of the gospel, because the gospel will be enduring, and you'll see that at the second coming. You can suffer and be persecuted and be marginalized. You can be hated by your family, and you can be painted into a corner by your employer, because the gospel will save you, not just today, but at the end of the age. Two quick conclusions, one for a Christian, one for a non-Christian. Christian, can we agree to not get too confident about reading the signs? Can we not lose our lives in staring at the Middle East and assuming that something in the Middle East is going to teach us now what to believe? Can we not be too drilled down on the news to see what's going on, such that we begin to measure our faith based upon those things that are happening? Can we not focus on those events that we think should be happening and therefore be filled with courage and confidence because, yes, you see, it's all happening. It's happening right in the Middle East. Can we lay that aside? And can we know who Christ is more and more deeply? That's what we should be doing. And we don't need the news, and we don't need to speculate about political events. We are to know who Jesus Christ is. That's our assurance. And we are to endure. The suffering, it's normal. It's what we're called to do. Suffering's not an aberration. Suffering is not that single thing that you need to make go away. Christian, let's not get too wrapped up in signs of the times. Let's know Christ, and let's be willing to suffer for his name's sake. And very quickly, if you're here and you're not a Christian, the time to wait is over. Would you please talk to someone here at King's Cross about what it means to believe in Jesus? You know, look at our church calendar. We have an upcoming membership class. To be a member at King's Cross, you do not have to be Presbyterian or a Calvinist. You do have to believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ. We have a membership class that's coming up. There's a book on the back table called What is the Gospel? It's a black book. It's small. As you walk out, just take it. That is how we do membership interviews here at King's Cross. But if you're here this morning, you're not a Christian, the time to wait is over. Would you join me in prayer?